I came to the bank to get a $5,000 loan, but the manager said, "Ma'am, you have $43 million in your account. Why do you need a loan?" I had never seen that kind of money and had always lived modestly. But when I found out... Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought of myself as a woman who could be fooled. I spent 31 years teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary in Dayton, Ohio. 31 years of watching children learn to read, to add, to tell right from wrong. I knew when a kid was lying about his homework. I knew when a little girl was hiding tears behind a smile. I thought I understood people. I was wrong about the ones closest to me. My husband Daniel was a quiet man, not cold, just contained, the way certain rivers are, deep and steady beneath a calm surface. We married young, built a life slowly, brick by brick. A small house on Carpenter Street with a porch I loved and a garden Daniel never quite managed to keep alive. He worked in finance his whole career. Not flashy, not Wall Street, just careful, methodical work at a regional investment firm. He never talked much about money at home. "The money takes care of itself," he used to say, "as long as you leave it alone." I smiled and let him handle it. That was our arrangement, and it worked fine for 23 years. When Daniel died of a heart attack in March of 2016, I became a person I didn't recognize. Grief does that. It hollows you out and leaves behind someone who looks like you but can't quite function like you. I forgot to eat. I forgot to pay bills. I stood in the cereal aisle at Kroger for 15 minutes once, holding a box of Cheerios, unable to remember why I'd come. That's when Ronald and Cynthia stepped in. Ronald was Daniel's younger brother, louder, smoother, always with a firm handshake and a ready smile. Cynthia matched him perfectly, polished, warm in the particular way that real estate agents and megachurch greeters are warm. They drove up from Columbus the week after the funeral with casseroles and condolences and a quiet suggestion. "Peggy, honey," Cynthia said, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, "you are in no state to be dealing with finances. Let Ronald take a look at things. Just temporarily. Just until you're back on your feet." I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was holding a box of Cheerios in my mind every waking hour. Ronald had himself added as a co-manager on Daniel's primary investment accounts. "Just administrative access," he explained, sliding papers across the table with the ease of a man who had practiced this. I signed where he pointed. I didn't read carefully. I was 55 years old and I didn't read carefully. That is the thing I will never fully forgive myself for. The years passed. I went back to teaching. I tended my garden. I learned to be alone. Ronald and Cynthia called on birthdays and holidays, sometimes brought wine when they visited, always asked how I was doing with the performative concern of people who needed to appear caring. I took it at face value. Why wouldn't I? The first crack appeared 18 months ago. I had finally decided to update my will, something my friend Carol had been nudging me about for years. I made an appointment with a lawyer, a straightforward woman named Patricia Howe, and she asked me to bring in a summary of my assets. I pulled out the folder Daniel had kept, the one labeled Household Finances, in his neat block letters. Inside were account statements, insurance documents, the deed to the house. The numbers didn't add up. I'm a 3rd grade teacher, not an accountant, but I knew what Daniel had told me we had. I knew roughly what retirement should look like. What I saw in that folder was roughly 40% of what I expected. I told myself I'd misremembered. I told myself the market had been rough. I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. But something small and cold settled in my chest and didn't leave. I started paying attention differently after that. Small things, Ronald's new truck, the vacation photos Cynthia posted, Tuscany, Barbados, a ski lodge somewhere. They'd always been comfortable, but this was something else. When I mentioned to Ronald that I was thinking of meeting with a financial advisor, the warmth in his voice dropped by exactly 1 degree. Just one. But I was a woman who had watched children's faces for 31 years. I noticed. Then came the morning I walked into First Midwest Bank on Salem Avenue to ask about taking out a small personal loan, $5,000 for a new HVAC system the house badly needed. The manager, a young man named Kevin, typed in my name and my social security number. He looked at his screen, looked at me, looked at his screen again. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you have a balance of $43 million in an investment account under your name. Why would you need a loan?" I sat very still. The fluorescent lights hummed above us. Someone's phone rang in the lobby behind me. "I'm sorry," I said. "Could you say that again?" Kevin said it again. $43,412,000 in an account bearing my name and social security number, opened in 2009 under the name Daniel R. Collins Trust. Beneficiary, Margaret A. Collins. I asked Kevin if I could have a glass of water. He brought it in a paper cup. I drank it slowly and tried to think. Daniel had never mentioned this account. Not once in the 7 years between 2009 and his death. Not in his folder. Not in any document Ronald had ever shown me. I had handed Ronald administrative access to every account I knew about, and somehow this one had never come up. Was that an accident? Could a person simply forget a $43 million trust account? I drove home on autopilot. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Cynthia had offered to help 8 years ago, and I put both hands flat on the wood and breathed. My garden was visible through the back window, the rose bushes coming in nicely for June. Normal. Everything looked completely, mockingly normal. Then I opened my laptop and I started adding things up. I am not an accountant, but I am a woman who has balanced a household budget for 30 years, and I am a woman who spent 3 decades teaching children that if something doesn't add up, you check your work. I pulled every statement from Daniel's folder. I cross-referenced dates. I wrote numbers in a yellow legal pad in my neatest handwriting, the way I wrote lesson plans. By midnight, I had a rough picture, and it was ugly. From the accounts Ronald had managed over 8 years, approximately $380,000 had moved in ways I could not explain. Transfers to entities I didn't recognize, management fees that seemed invented, disbursements with no corresponding benefit to me. $380,000, nearly $400,000 that should have been mine, quietly redirected over 8 years in small enough increments that no single transaction looked alarming. I sat back and stared at the ceiling. Here was the thing that frightened me most. Ronald didn't know about the trust. If he had known, he would have emptied it long ago. Daniel had hidden it, deliberately it seemed, had kept it sealed away, the beneficiary designation quietly passing it to me outside of probate, which meant Ronald had stolen what he could reach, but he'd missed the biggest thing entirely. If I walked into that house and confronted him tomorrow, I would be handing him a grenade. I thought about calling the police. I thought about calling Patricia Howe, my lawyer. I thought about calling my sister in Phoenix. What I actually did was close my laptop, go to bed, and stare at the dark for 4 hours. Fear is strange. It doesn't always make you small. Sometimes it crystallizes you. Somewhere around 3 a.m., lying in Daniel's house, in Daniel's bed, thinking about Daniel's money that Ronald had spent on Tuscany and ski lodges, I felt something shift inside me. The hollow grief person who had signed those papers in a fog 8 years ago was still in there somewhere, but she was no longer in charge. I thought, Daniel left me this. He built it quietly, carefully, over years, the way he did everything. He never made a fuss. He just made sure I would be okay. He left it to me, and I was going to keep it. The plan came together over the following week, and it was not dramatic. There were no schemes, no clever tricks, no movie moments. It was simply the plan of a careful, patient woman who had spent a career watching children and understanding that the best way to protect something fragile is to be very, very quiet about it. Step 1, say nothing to Ronald. Nothing. Not a hint, not a question, not a probing remark about finances. Our relationship would continue to look exactly as it always had. Step 2, get proper legal representation. Not Patricia Howe, who was perfectly fine for wills, but not for this. I needed a financial fraud attorney. I needed someone who handled exactly this kind of case, quietly and aggressively. Step 3, document everything. Every transfer I'd found, every fee, every anomaly. Build the record before doing anything else. Step 4, secure the trust account. Move it, protect it, make sure Ronald could never gain access if he somehow found out it existed. I wrote these steps in the yellow legal pad. Then I tore out the page, folded it twice, and tucked it inside my copy of To Kill a Mockingbird on the bookshelf. The last place Ronald Collins would ever look. I made coffee. I went to school. I smiled at my students. I had a plan. The attorney's name was James Whitfield, and Carol had found him for me. Carol, my oldest friend, the only person I told, sworn to silence over coffee at her kitchen table with a seriousness that surprised even her. Peggy, she said when I finished explaining, "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said. Whitfield's office was in a professional building downtown, 3rd floor, the kind of place with thick carpet and diplomas arranged with deliberate modesty on the wall. He was in his late 40s, unhurried, with reading glasses he took off and set down before he spoke. I liked him immediately. I laid out everything. The trust account, the folder, the yellow legal pad, the transfers I couldn't explain. He listened without interrupting. Then he put his glasses back on and looked at the numbers. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "this is a civil matter, potentially a criminal one. Before we determine which, I need certified account records going back to 2016, not your copies. Certified originals from the financial institutions. How do I get those without Ronald knowing? Because you are the account holder and the sole beneficiary of the trust. You have the legal right to request complete records independently. Ronald has no right to be notified of your request." He paused. He had no legal right to manage your accounts in the first place without a proper power of attorney, which, based on what you're describing, you never formally granted. That landed hard. I had signed papers at a kitchen table while I was barely functioning, and whatever those papers said, they may not have been what Ronald described them as. I left Whitfield's office with a list of certified record requests to file and a quiet fury that I kept very carefully off my face as I walked to my car. The requests went out that week. It took 11 days to receive the first setback. In the meantime, something changed with Ronald. I don't know what triggered it. Perhaps he'd noticed my appointment with Patricia Howe months ago and had been watching since then. Perhaps it was pure instinct, the kind that criminals apparently develop. But the Friday after I filed the record requests, Ronald called me. "Peggy, just checking in. How are you doing, sweetheart?" He called me sweetheart approximately never. I sat very still on my porch and kept my voice warm. "Oh, I'm just fine, Ronald. Beautiful weather out here. The roses are coming in." "Good, good. Hey, I've been meaning to come up and go over some of the account paperwork with you. Just routine maintenance, you know how it is. Maybe next week." "Of course," I said. "Anytime." I hung up and sat with the roses and the late afternoon light and the very clear understanding that Ronald Collins was beginning to feel something he didn't like. The certified records arrived on a Tuesday. I drove them straight to Whitfield's office. He spent 40 minutes with them while I sat in the client chair and looked at the diplomas on the wall. Then he turned to me and his expression was the professional version of grim. "Mrs. Collins, I can now tell you with confidence that between 2016 and 2024, approximately $412,000 was moved from accounts under your name through a series of management fee assessments, advisory charges, and direct transfers to an LLC registered in Ronald Collins' name, RC Financial Consulting, LLC. This LLC does not appear to have provided any services to you. The transfers were structured carefully, never more than $18,000 in a single transaction, which suggests deliberate effort to stay below federal reporting thresholds." I heard him say it. I heard every word clearly. "Is that a crime?" I asked, though I knew. "Structuring transfers to avoid reporting thresholds is a federal offense," he said. "And that's before we address the fraudulent misrepresentation of the management agreement you signed, which I believe was deliberately presented to you under false pretenses during a period of documented grief." The fluorescent light in his office was slightly different from the one in the bank, but in both places I had sat very still and breathed slowly and waited for the world to finish rearranging itself. "What do I do now?" I asked. "Now," Whitfield said, leaning forward slightly, "we begin to build the case, and you continue to give Ronald Collins absolutely no indication that anything has changed." I thought of the phone call. The roses are coming in. I thought I'd done that part right. "One more thing," Whitfield said. "The trust account. We need to move it immediately. Not to a different institution, but into a protected structure under your name alone, with no secondary access possible. If Ronald discovers it exists, you want it behind a wall he cannot touch." We began the transfer paperwork that afternoon. The point of no return, Whitfield said later, was the moment I received those certified records. He was right. Up until that Tuesday, I could have told myself I'd misremembered. I could have accepted Ronald's explanations. I could have been the woman who signed papers at kitchen tables. That version of me was gone now. Whitfield filed the civil complaint on a Thursday morning in late July. Simultaneous with the filing, he sent a formal notification letter to Ronald Collins via certified mail. Registered delivery, signature required. Standard procedure in civil fraud cases, he explained. Ronald would know by Friday. I spent Thursday evening in my garden. I pulled weeds until my knees ached, then sat on the porch steps with a glass of iced tea and listened to the neighborhood settle into night. The Hendersons' dog barked twice. A sprinkler ran somewhere down the street. I had set something in motion that could not be undone, and I sat with that fact the way you sit with weather, not fighting it, just present with it. Ronald called at 7:48 Friday morning. I let it go to voicemail. Then I played the message once, standing in my kitchen in my bathrobe. His voice was controlled. That was the first thing. Ronald was a man who became very controlled when he was frightened, and he was clearly frightened. "Peggy, I got a letter this morning that I think involves some kind of misunderstanding. I need you to call me back. There are things you don't understand about how Daniel managed his accounts, and I don't want you getting bad advice from people who don't have your best interests at heart. Call me." I forwarded the voicemail to Whitfield and did not call back. They came to the house on Saturday. I was in the garden when I heard the car pull up. Ronald's new truck, the one I'd noticed. He and Cynthia came around the side gate without knocking, which told me everything I needed to know about how they decided to handle this. Cynthia was carrying a dish, an actual casserole dish, covered in foil. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. "Peggy." Ronald's voice was warm and wounded simultaneously. "We need to talk." "You should have called first," I said. I kept my gardening gloves on. I didn't stand up. "We were worried about you." Cynthia set the casserole on the porch railing like a peace offering or a prop. "We think someone has been feeding you some very wrong information, and Whitfield handles all communication now," I said. "You have his number." Ronald's composure slipped. Just for a moment, just a tightening around the eyes. "Peggy, listen to me. If you proceed with this, you're going to destroy this family. Daniel would be devastated. He trusted me with..." "With what?" I said. Silence. "With what, Ronald? What did Daniel trust you with? Say it clearly, please." "He didn't. Of course he didn't." Cynthia put her hand on his arm, and I watched the two of them recalibrate in real time. "We can make this go away quietly," Ronald said finally, dropping the wounded warmth entirely. His voice was flat now, and this version of him was somehow easier to deal with because it was honest. "You don't understand what becomes public in a civil case. Your name, Daniel's name, all of it. Is that what you want?" His legacy dragged through. "My lawyer will be in touch," I said. I stood up, picked up my trowel, and went inside. I locked the back door. I heard them stand on the porch for another minute. Then I heard the truck start. I sat on the kitchen floor for a while. Not because I was falling apart. I wasn't. But because my legs had decided they needed a moment. I had just looked Ronald Collins in the eyes and not moved. After 8 years of being managed and handled and gently deceived, I had sat in my garden with my gloves on and not moved an inch. But his threat about Daniel's name had landed. I wouldn't pretend it hadn't. I called Whitfield Monday morning and we talked through it. Civil court records were mostly public, yes. Some things could be sealed. We would manage it. He had handled this before. I took 4 days off from the plan after that, not from Whitfield's work, which continued, but from the internal vigilance. I drove to Columbus not to see Ronald, but to see the botanical garden there, which I hadn't visited in years. I walked through it for 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon. Orchids, a whole room of them. I had dinner with Carol that Friday. I didn't talk about the case. We talked about her granddaughter who had just learned to ride a bike, and about a book we'd both read, and about whether the new Italian place on 5th was as good as people said. It was exactly as good as people said. I went home feeling like myself, steadier, ready. The offer came through a third party, which told me they'd gotten legal advice of their own. A letter arrived from an attorney named Gerald Marsh, representing Ronald and Cynthia Collins, proposing a confidential settlement discussion. The letter was professionally courteous and carefully vague, but the number buried in paragraph 4 was $175,000, a lump sum, paid privately, in exchange for dismissal of the civil complaint and a mutual non-disparagement agreement. I read it twice at my kitchen table, in the same chair where Cynthia had once offered me a casserole and 8 years of financial theft. $175,000, against $412,000 stolen, against $43 million secured, against 8 years of being quietly, carefully handled by people who had counted on my grief, making me compliant. Did they actually believe that would work? Or was it a test to see how much I understood, how much I knew, how frightened I still was? I forwarded it to Whitfield with a single line, "Please decline." He called me that afternoon. "They've also filed a counterclaim," he said, with a tone that suggested this was expected, alleging that the management agreement you signed in 2016 was a valid contract conferring legitimate advisory authority and that all fees charged were disclosed. Were they disclosed? According to the documentation, there was a disclosure clause, 3 pages deep in a 12-page document written at an approximately 16th grade reading level, which you signed 5 days after your husband's funeral. He paused. "We'll address it." I thanked him and hung up. I made tea. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden, where the last of the summer roses were beginning to go, petals loosening in the warm August air. I was not afraid of Ronald's counterclaim. What I felt, if I'm honest, was a cold, clean clarity. They were going to fight. Of course they were. They had too much to lose to simply fold, and I had too much at stake to let the fight frighten me back into the kitchen table version of myself. That afternoon, I called my sister Beverly in Phoenix. I told her everything. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Beverly said, "Peggy, I'm coming to Dayton." She arrived 2 days later with a suitcase and a fury that I found quietly sustaining. Beverly was 3 years younger than me and had always been the louder of the two of us. A retired nurse, precise and no nonsense, the kind of woman who asked follow-up questions. She sat at my table and read through the documents I'd compiled, and she didn't say a word for 20 minutes. "Ronald Collins," she finally said, "sat at Dad's Christmas table and ate our mother's cooking." "I know." "He flew to Daniel's funeral." "I know, Bev." She looked at me steadily. "Are you okay?" "I'm more okay than I've been in 8 years," I said, and I meant it. Beverly stayed for a week. She came with me to one of the Whitfield meetings and asked 3 questions that Whitfield said were quite perceptive. She reorganized my filing system and labeled everything clearly and alphabetically, which was her way of helping. She cooked dinners that filled the house with a warmth it hadn't had in a long time. When she left, she stood at the door and held both my hands and said, "Daniel knew what he was doing. He left that account for you. You are exactly who he thought you were." I held that for a long time after her car disappeared down Carpenter Street. Meanwhile, Ronald and Cynthia had gone quiet. No calls, no drive-bys. Gerald Marsh communicated only through Whitfield now. They were watching, regrouping, deciding how to proceed. Let them watch. I had stopped being afraid of being watched. Patricia Howe, my original lawyer, the one who'd first noticed the numbers didn't add up, referred me to 2 other women who had been through similar situations, different circumstances, same essential story of trust exploited during vulnerability. We met for coffee once, the 3 of us, at a diner on the east side of town. We didn't talk about legal strategy. We talked about what it felt like to realize you'd been handled, to decide you were done being handled. Driving home, I thought about Daniel, about how he'd worked quietly his entire life, making careful decisions, never drawing attention, about how he'd opened that trust account in 2009 and told no one and simply left it there, growing, with my name on it. He knew, I thought. He didn't know Ronald specifically, maybe, but he understood something about the world, about how money could disappear, about how grief could make a person vulnerable. And he'd built a wall around me that no one knew was there, including me. I was going to finish what he started. They came back in September, and this time they called first. That alone should have told me it was a performance. Ronald's voice on the phone was different, softer, stripped of the professional smoothness. "Peggy, I know things have gotten. I know we're in a bad place. But you're my sister-in-law, and I loved my brother, and I think before this goes any further, we owe it to Daniel to at least sit down together. Without lawyers, just family." I said I would think about it. I called Whitfield. He was measured but clear. Any meeting with them was my choice, but I should not discuss the case, accept any documents, or say anything that could be characterized as an agreement or concession. If I chose to meet, I should consider having Carol present as a witness. I called Carol. She cleared her Saturday. They arrived at 2:00. Cynthia had dressed carefully. Soft colors, no jewelry, the visual vocabulary of humility. Ronald was in a button-down shirt, no tie, the carefully assembled look of a man being sincere. I showed them into the living room. Carol sat in the armchair by the window, and I introduced her simply as my friend Carol, and watched Ronald's eyes flicker to her and then away. He hadn't expected a witness. That small miscalculation told me they'd planned this visit around a version of me that no longer existed. "We've been doing a lot of thinking," Ronald began. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, the posture of earnest confession. "And Cynthia and I both know that in trying to help you, we may have made decisions that didn't look right, looking back. And that's on us. We should have been more transparent. 8 years of structured transfers to a shell LLC, and the word he'd chosen was transparent. We're not here to argue about numbers," Cynthia added quickly. Her voice had a practiced tremor in it. "We're here because we're family, because Daniel was Ronald's brother, and he loved him, and we love you, Peggy. And this legal process is going to hurt everyone. It's going to hurt Daniel's name. Is that what he would have wanted?" There it was. I'd been waiting for it. Was that what Daniel would have wanted? It was a beautiful question, as manipulations go, because it was unanswerable, and it pointed at grief, and grief in a living room makes everything blurry. I thought of Daniel, his careful handwriting, his quiet confidence that things would be all right as long as you left them alone. What would he have wanted? He would have wanted his wife protected. He had built an entire hidden trust account to make sure of it. "I think Daniel would have wanted me taken care of," I said pleasantly. "That's why he left me everything." A muscle moved in Ronald's jaw. "Peggy." His voice changed register. Just slightly. Just enough. The warmth was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something pressurized. "You need to think very carefully about what pursuing this means for everyone. The counterclaim we filed. Marsh says there's a real argument that the agreement you signed in 2016 was fully valid. If a judge agrees with that, you don't just lose the case. You lose legal standing to contest any of the fees. You could end up with nothing, and you'd have spent your savings on Whitfield's fees for nothing." "That's your lawyer's opinion," I said. "Mine has a different one." "There are also things that could come out in discovery," he continued, and now his voice was very quiet, "that you might not want out. About Daniel's business dealings, about the structure of the trust account itself, and why he chose not to disclose it during his lifetime. Judges and juries don't always look kindly on—" "Ronald," I said, "stop. He stopped. If you had something that could damage my case, your attorney would have used it already. You're telling me about it now, in my living room, without Marsh present, because it doesn't exist. It's a suggestion. You're very good at suggestions. The room was very still. Carol, to her credit, did not move or make a sound. Cynthia leaned forward then and reached across the coffee table, placing her hand over mine with the gentleness of someone who had practiced the gesture. We just don't want this for you, Peggy. All this stress, all this fighting. You deserve peace. We could figure this out between ourselves, quietly, without courts, without any of this becoming public. Isn't that worth something to you? Her eyes were wet. I looked at them and thought, she's done this before. This exact gesture, this exact expression. It was too fluent to be real. I moved my hand away slowly, without drama. I know you don't, I said, and I stood up, which ended the meeting. Whitfield's office will be in touch about discovery scheduling. They left. I stood at the front window and watched the truck pull away. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, or not only from fear, from adrenaline, from the physical effort of staying completely level while Ronald tested the structural integrity of everything I'd built. He was good at this. He had spent a lifetime being good at this, but the trembling, strangely, helped. Because it reminded me that I was not made of stone, that this cost me something, and that choosing to pay the cost anyway meant something. The fear didn't weaken my resolve. It confirmed it. I was right to fight. You don't shake like this over something that doesn't matter. Carol stayed for dinner. She made pasta because she knew where everything was in my kitchen by now. We didn't do a full debrief of what had happened. She just cooked, and I set the table, and we ate. And at some point, she said, "You were magnificent." And I said, "I was terrified." And she said, "Those aren't mutually exclusive." And we let it go at that. The deposition took place on a Tuesday in October in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building downtown. Gray industrial carpet, a long table, a court reporter with her machine. Whitfield on one side, Gerald Marsh, and Ronald Collins on the other. I sat at the head of the table because this was my case, and Whitfield had suggested it, quietly when we arranged the seating. Cynthia was not present. She had a separate deposition scheduled for Thursday. I had prepared for this the way I prepared for parent-teacher conferences, thoroughly, specifically, and with the understanding that the person across from me would be emotional and I would need to be the calm one. I had gone over every document with Whitfield twice. I knew the LLC formation date, the first transfer date, the total figure, the pattern. I knew it the way I had once known my multiplication tables, not because I'd memorized it for this occasion, but because I had lived inside it for months, turning it over until it was simply a part of what I understood to be true. Ronald looked older than the last time I'd seen him. Something in the weeks since September had thinned him out, not physically, but in some quality of bearing, the easy authority he always carried. Marsh was polished and careful, an older man who handled white-collar cases and would have been formidable in other circumstances. They had, as it turned out, a problem. The problem was RC Financial Consulting, LLC. Whitfield had dug into it thoroughly. The LLC had been registered in 2015, 1 year before Daniel died, and in the 7 months between Daniel's death and the first fee charged to my accounts, it had collected $0 from any client. Its only income, in its entire existence, had been from accounts it managed under my name and social security number. This was not the behavior of a legitimate advisory firm. The second problem was the structuring. Whitfield's forensic accountant, a compact, meticulous woman named Dr. Elaine Park, who I'd met twice and trusted completely, had prepared a chart showing every transfer to RC Financial Consulting from my accounts. 41 transfers over 8 years, every single one between $9,000 and $17,500. The federal reporting threshold for cash transactions was $10,000, but for wire transfers and bank structuring, the relevant threshold was $10,000, and the pattern of keeping most transfers just below it or in the ambiguous range was, Dr. Park had written in her report, consistent with deliberate structuring to avoid BSA reporting requirements. When Marsh presented his client's position that the 2016 management agreement was a valid contract, properly disclosed, Whitfield produced the agreement itself and walked through it, section by section. Section 4.2, buried in paragraph 9 of page 8. All advisory fees shall be assessed at the advisor's discretion and may be modified without prior written notice. Mr. Collins, Whitfield said, can you tell me when you modified the fee schedule? It was an ongoing arrangement. When specifically did you notify Mrs. Collins of the fee modifications as contemplated by Section 4.2? It was understood to be a flexible arrangement. I'd like to enter into record, Whitfield said to the court reporter and slid a document across the table, that in a search of all communications between my client and Mr. Collins from 2016 to 2024, including emails, text messages, and postal correspondence obtained through discovery, there is no written communication from Mr. Collins to my client regarding fees of any kind, not once in 8 years. Ronald looked at Marsh. Marsh's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. Mr. Collins, did you disclose the existence of RC Financial Consulting, LLC, to my client at any point before or during the signing of the 2016 management agreement? Pause. We discussed my background in finance. I asked specifically about RC Financial Consulting, LLC. The entity wasn't. It wasn't the focus of our conversation. Was it mentioned at all? Another pause. Longer this time. Ronald shifted in his chair, a small involuntary movement, the kind a person makes when the chair they're sitting in has become somehow less comfortable. I watched him and thought, this is what it looks like when a story fails to hold. I don't believe it was mentioned by name. I sat at the head of the table and said nothing. I had been instructed to say nothing unless directly asked, and I was very good at following instructions when they served me. What I watched was a man discovering, in real time, that the story he had told himself, that it was all technically legal, that there were agreements, that nothing had been hidden exactly, was not going to survive contact with specificity. Ronald Collins had built his case on the assumption that I was still the woman in the fog at the kitchen table. He had not accounted for 8 years of interest, for a forensic accountant, for 41 transfers in a chart. Marsh called a 15-minute break. During the break, I stepped into the hallway for water. Through the glass panel of the conference room door, I could see Ronald and Marsh in conversation. Ronald's head bent forward, Marsh speaking quietly, one hand gesturing in a way that said damage control. Ronald rubbed his face once with both hands. Then he sat back and stared at the ceiling for a moment, the gesture of a man doing arithmetic that isn't coming out right. I had seen that expression on children's faces. It meant the answer they'd been counting on wasn't there. When we reconvened, Marsh asked to schedule a follow-up session and raise the subject of renewed settlement discussions. Whitfield said he would consult with his client. We stepped outside afterward onto the downtown sidewalk, October air bright and cold and clarifying. Whitfield allowed himself a small, satisfied expression. "They're going to come with a new number," he said. "What do we do?" "We let them," he said, "and then we decide whether it's worth more to settle or to let this go to trial." I looked down the street. Coffee shops, a bookstore, ordinary Tuesday life moving in both directions. "What happens at trial?" I asked. "Everything we showed today in front of a judge, plus the structuring evidence which I've referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office as of this morning." I looked at him. "Criminal referral?" "It's my professional obligation," he said. And yes. They came back with $280,000. Whitfield brought me the offer on a Thursday afternoon, laid it on his desk without comment, and waited for me to read it. I set it back down. "No." He nodded. "I thought you'd say that." "What do we have?" "A strong civil case. Likely recovery of the $412,000 plus interest, which brings it to approximately $490,000. Punitive damages possible given the structuring evidence, which could double that. Attorney's fees if the court finds the fraud was willful." He paused. "And the U.S. Attorney's Office contacted me this morning. They're opening a preliminary investigation into the structuring." "What does that mean for them?" Structuring, if prosecuted and convicted, carries federal penalties, including fines and up to 5 years per count. With 41 transfers, the exposure is significant. Whether the U.S. attorney chooses to prosecute depends on factors outside my control. But the referral is in, and the pattern is documented. I thought for a moment. If we settle, does the criminal investigation stop? Civil settlement has no effect on federal criminal proceedings. Once the referral is made, it belongs to the government. I understood. The choice before me was narrow, whether to take what Ronald offered or to take what the court would give me. Either way, the criminal question would proceed. Ronald and Cynthia were going to face federal scrutiny regardless of whether I accepted their check. That knowledge clarified everything. There was no longer any reason for compromise. "Let it go to trial," I said. The civil trial lasted 3 days in early February. Dr. Elaine Park testified for 90 minutes. She walked the court through all 41 transfers, the LLC's formation date, its income history, the structuring pattern. She was precise and unhurried and answered Marcia's cross-examination with the serenity of someone who had done this many times and was no longer impressed by attempts to rattle her. She used charts and she used plain language in the same sentence, and I watched the judge follow every word, facts, laid out in order, without embellishment. That's all justice ever really needs. I testified for 45 minutes. I described signing the papers 5 days after Daniel's funeral. I described not understanding the LLC was receiving my money. I described the phone call where Ronald mentioned coming to go over paperwork the same week I had filed the record requests. I was clear. I did not editorialize. I answered exactly what was asked, and I paused before each answer. Not from uncertainty, but from the habit of care that a lifetime of teaching had given me. Say the true thing. Say it once. Say it clearly. Marsh put Ronald on the stand, and it was, from a certain angle, painful to watch. Not because I felt sorry for Ronald, but because I watched a man try to hold a story together that no longer had structural integrity. He stumbled over dates. He could not explain the formation of the LLC in 2015 without inadvertently suggesting premeditation. He said, at one point, that the transfers were industry standard advisory compensation, and Whitfield, on cross, asked him to name one other client of RC Financial Consulting, LLC. Ronald could not. There was a silence in the courtroom that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time when everyone in the room understands its meaning. The judge, a careful woman in her 60s named the Honorable Patricia Walsh, took 2 days to deliberate. Her ruling came on a Thursday morning, and Whitfield and I sat together in his office to receive it. Full judgment for the plaintiff. Recovery of $412,000 in fraudulent transfers. Prejudgment interest of $89,000. Punitive damages of $350,000 on the grounds that the fraud was willful and deliberate, exploiting a specific vulnerability. Attorney's fees of $47,000. Total judgment, $898,000. I read the number 3 times. Judge Walsh, Whitfield said, was not lenient. The federal investigation moved more slowly as federal investigations do, but by April, Ronald Collins and Cynthia Collins were formally indicted on 3 counts each: wire fraud, bank fraud, and structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements. Gerald Marsh withdrew from representation. The case was beyond what he handled, and the Collinses retained a criminal defense attorney from Cincinnati. I received a call from a victim's advocate at the U.S. Attorney's Office. They were professional and careful and asked if I wished to provide a victim impact statement when sentencing came. I said yes. I wrote the statement at my kitchen table, in the same chair, in the same room where Cynthia had set down a casserole and offered to help me 8 years ago. I wrote it in 3 drafts over 2 evenings. It was not angry. It described, plainly and precisely, what had been done and what it had cost. Not just the money, but the 8 years of being gently, continuously handled. The quiet erosion of a person's confidence in her own judgment. I wrote, "My husband left me this money because he understood that I would be vulnerable after his death. He built something to protect me that I didn't know existed. The defendants chose to exploit that vulnerability. I am here to ensure the record reflects precisely what that choice was." The Collinses entered guilty pleas in September, a negotiated plea to reduce exposure. Ronald was sentenced to 22 months in federal prison plus 3 years of supervised release and ordered to pay full restitution to me and the IRS. Cynthia received 18 months of supervised probation, a $95,000 fine, and community service, having cooperated substantially with federal investigators. The gavel came down on a Tuesday. I was not in the courtroom. I was in my garden with the last of the autumn roses when Whitfield called me. I thanked him. I stood in my garden for a long time afterward, looking at what Daniel had planted with me years ago, the beds I'd tended alone, the roses that came back every year regardless. I thought, that's done. I retired from Millbrook Elementary in June, at the end of the school year. After the weight of 18 months of legal proceedings had finally lifted, I understood that what I wanted most was time. Not luxury, not drama, just time and quiet and the right to decide what each day would hold. My students gave me a card signed by all 22 of them, with drawings of flowers and what one boy named Marcus had labeled Mrs. Collins's Roses in large, confident letters. I kept it on the kitchen counter for a month. The first thing I did with the judgment money, beyond paying Whitfield, was have the HVAC replaced. The very thing I'd gone to the bank for. The technician explained the thermostat settings, and I thought, this is where it started. $5,000 and a life I didn't know I had. I set up a scholarship at Millbrook Elementary, the Daniel R. Collins Scholarship, for a graduating fifth grader to receive a book allowance and a $500 savings bond for college. Small. Exactly the right size. Daniel would have wanted nothing showy. The house on Carpenter Street I kept. I kept coming back to the porch and the garden and the particular quality of afternoon light in the kitchen. The house wasn't haunted by grief. It was inhabited by it, which was different. Grief could be a companion rather than a weight. I had the back garden expanded, a proper rose garden now, with a gravel path and a bench, and a small Japanese maple that Beverly chose when she came back in the spring. We planted it together on a Saturday morning, kneeling in the dirt, saying nothing profound, which was perfect. I began to travel thoughtfully. 2 weeks in Portugal in October. Lisbon's hills, the light on the water, the tile work in every doorway. I went alone and found that I preferred it. I ate dinner late, drank very good wine, read on restaurant terraces, and was precisely as happy as I had decided to be. I made new friends, a book group Carol brought me into, and a master gardening class that introduced me to Harriet, a retired doctor with opinions about hydrangeas and a wonderful dry laugh. Carol and I continued to meet for coffee and pasta, and occasionally to sit on my porch and watch the evening come in. Ronald Collins reported to federal prison in January. I know this because Whitfield's office received confirmation of the restitution payment schedule. I did not seek further information. The house in Columbus was sold to cover the fine and restitution. Cynthia moved to a smaller rental in a suburb she had never found interesting. Her social media accounts, the Tuscany photos, the Barbados photos, the ski lodge, were quietly deleted during the criminal proceedings. Ronald's professional licenses were revoked. RC Financial Consulting, LLC, was dissolved by order of the court. I do not know if they speak to each other. The shape of their life now is a consequence of the shape of their choices. What I found in the months after everything settled was something I hadn't expected, a lightness, not simple happiness. I was still a widow, still living with the ordinary textures of loss and time, but something that had been coiled inside me for years finally released. Self-trust. I had doubted myself so thoroughly after Daniel died, handed over my judgment, my finances, my certainty, and then, slowly, over 18 months of the hardest kind of attention, I had gotten it back. One afternoon in July, sitting on the bench beneath the Japanese maple, I thought, Daniel knew who you were. He built the account and left it for you because he believed you would know what to do. He was right. I am 61 years old. I tend my garden. I remember Daniel every day, and I sign nothing, without reading it first. What would you have done? If this story moved you, share it, leave a comment, and let me know your thoughts. Thank you for listening. It means